Our next speaker is Hopperdietzel, and as far as I understand, there is no presentation but a handout which should be distributed. The title of the talk is Causative Morphology and Resultative Secondary Predication, the case of Samoan.
Yes, thank you very much. So to start with, I will present you some data. So as typical for Oceanic languages, resultative secondary predication in Samoan is realized by zero verb constructions, as we see in 1. And what we basically see is that an initial manner verb, the V1, specifies an event that causes a change of state. While the result state is expressed by a property concept word, the V2, which is crucially marked obligatory by the causative prefix. So what we see in 1a, for example, where we have the zero verb construction chu cause soft, lamu fa malu, and we see in all the examples that the fa is obligatory realized there. So however, the marking of the causative relation by a special morpheme within RSP is rather unexpected cross-linguistically. So in non-serializing languages like English, the result state is necessarily encoded by a non-verbal element like an AP, PP, or a small clause, whatever, which is combined with a manner verb without overt causative or incausative morphology. So we have the English examples here. We have the grammatical variation, Mary pounded the apple flat, but Mary pounded the apple flattened or Mary pound flattened the apple are ungrammatical. The same is true for many other serializing languages like Edo, Mandarin, or Dakaka, which is also an Oceanic language, where the result state is encoded via a stative verb without overt causative morphology, which we see in 3. In 3a, for example, the both verbal predicates are beat and be thin, but be thin is here not marked by a causative prefix. So the question is, which I will address in this talk, is what determines the occurrence of causative morphology in Samoan type RSP. And what I will propose is that in Samoan type languages, causative morphology is a spell out of the eventive verbalizer little v, which is sensitive to the presence of the voice head in bi-eventive context. I will show you later what this means. And crucially, this structural configuration is matched in resultative secondary predication here. So what I will do is I will first present a short background on Samoan, then I will briefly introduce resultative secondary predication. Then I go on to the syntactic approach to event decomposition because it's quite relevant for my analysis. Then I will turn back to the Samoan data, to far causative first, and then in the end to the resultative secondary predication. So to start with Samoan, it's a language, it's a Polynesian language which belongs to the Oceanic branch of the Austronesian family, which is spoken on the Samoa Islands. It's basically in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and it's spoken by roughly 470,000 speakers, mostly on the islands. It has a VSO word structure, and the categories, that's quite interesting though, but it's not relevant for my analysis here, but just to mention, my analysis will be like in the pre-movement whatever stage, so I will not deal with that. Turning to the categories, so in Samoan, lexical items seems to be underspecified regarding their categorical class. So with a few restrictions, roots can be functioned as nouns, verbs, adjectives, or adverbs without derivational morphology. And so only the structural configuration or position they appear in indicates as what kind of predicate is used. So this we see in 5, where we have the root lele, good. It can be used as a predicative, so something is good when it is marked with a tense morpheme. It can be used attributive, like in the good thing, or it can be even used as adverbial, and the sun shines nicely or well. Yes. So, but in the following, I will not make a clear. I do not really make a big claim about that. So they have to be treated as adjectival verbs or verbal adjectives. I mostly don't care. I will treat them here as adjectival, but you can interchange this with a stative verbal adjectival verbs as well. Coming to case marking, Samoan is a split ergative language, which is shown in 6. So while true ergative predicates marks the subject with ergative and the object with absolutive, there are so-called middles, where the objects are optional, and these verbs have an transitive subject which is absolutive and object which is marked as accusative or oblique. There's a discussion in the literature, but it's not that it's not really matters here. And intransitive subjects are only marked for absolutive. And based on these observations, Toll in 2018 proposed a split in the voice domain into a voice set, which introduces high agentive external arguments, and an absolutive that introduces low agentive external arguments. This will be a bit important later. So turning to resultative secondary predication. RSP is a form of complex predicate formation that has gained a lot of attention in the syntactic and semantic research for a long time, and in typology now more recently. And to define this complex predication, we can use definition by Williams. So resultative secondary predication is a single clause comprising 2 overt predicates, a manner predicate and that describes the process, and a result predicate that describes the result state caused by the first predicate. So we have seen the example, Anna hammers metal flat. And while typologically RSP seem to be widely attested, they show some crucial variation across languages. And one established fit, there are some more, is that between serializing languages and non-serializing languages. And Larson, 1991, proposed therefore the serialization parameter, which is primarily with the category of the secondary predicate. So where in non-serializing languages we can have AP, NP, or PP, so basically non-verbal secondary predicates. In serializing languages, it's the other way around, although the parameter is maybe a bit too strict, because it seems like in serializing languages, PP or AP secondary predicates are also possible. So we see the example in 12 and 13, they're basically the same as in the beginning. So we'll turn to causative morphology in oceanic RSP. So quite recently in the typological study on resultative languages, or resultatives in oceanic languages, Furkirk and Forster revealed another type of RSP that exhibits causative morphology on secondary predicates. So we see this in 14 for quite a range of languages. There are even more, like up to, I think they had a sample of around 50 languages, and 20 to 30 of them have this causative morphology. And which is typical for the manner for this construction is that the manner component is expressed by a transitive manner predicate, while the result is encoded by a causative property concept root. And as I've said, cross-linguistically, this pattern is quite unusual. So maybe that is worth a look, to take a closer look at it. So if we now focus onto Samoan as a case study, we see in 16 even more examples as I've shown you before. So we have something like chew cause soft, cut cause small, sew cause long, or cut cause short. And the distribution of the roots is, as we expected before from the construction, that we have in the V1 slot transitive manner roots like cut, iron, or chew, and in the V2 property concept roots like small or long. And this somehow reflects the manner result complementarity by Levin and Rappaport, which is also quite interesting, I think. So what more to say is that both elements in this construction seem to be syntactically very close, because nothing can appear in between these two verbs. So maybe you can even think of a compound construction, but a prosodic analysis of these things is lacking by now. But when you want to have elements like adverbials or depictive, they all occur to the right of this whole complex. So this is like the broad overview about the thing I'm talking about, and now I will turn to the formalization first of the approach. Sorry. So within the framework of distributed morphology, Event decomposition and argument structure is assumed to be built within the syntactic derivation by itself and not be projected by the roots. So at first, I will introduce the root hypothesis. So roots themselves are acategorial and do not make any reference to the category, argument structure, or event type by itself. This helps us also a bit to explain why in Samoan these roots can function as different type of predicates, like nouns, adjectives, verbs, and so on. Instead, roots get their categorization by merging with a categorizing event or eventuality introducing head, like little v or little a. So not to confuse with the Chomsky little v. During this process, roots also get its idiosyncratic meaning, which is shown in 19. It's just a formalization of that. And in this talk, I will assume a single eventive verbalizer that introduces an underspecified event variable. So everything else is done by the semantics, by the write-up of the semantics later. And a stative adjectivizer that introduces a state variable. So we have in 20 little v, which encodes an event, and little a, which encodes a state. Turning to argument structure, because it's not projected by the root, the external argument is introduced by a separate voice projection, which is quite familiar, which takes a little VP as its complement, and as we have, as it was proposed by Tollen, we have a split in this domain, so we have both a voice P and an abs P here. On the contrary, the internal argument is introduced in the complement of little v or within a small clause, basically introduced by a functional head, which is shown 22, but it's not that relevant here. If we now turn to event decomposition, so if we adopt the view of Alexiade et al. 2015, event decomposition includes just a single layer, namely V, so nothing like as the flavors of little v, where we have a lot of different little v heads with different functions, but just a single one. And crucially, the structural configuration of how roots combine with this little v give rise to a particular semantic interpretation. So if it specifies it, it gets a manner interpretation, like run. For example, in 22, if we insert the root run there, then it gets the manner interpretation of run. If the root is in the complement, then it gets the state result interpretation. This reflects somehow the manner result complementarity proposed by Levin and Rappaport. So under this view, a resultative secondary predication occupies both structural position at once. So while we have the one root, like pound, the manner root, in the specifier position, we have another root in a bit more complex structure, though, in its complement position, specifying the result state that is being caused by the first event. So what is important here is that the causative semantic is read of the structural configuration, not implemented into a head. So these are like the basics. Now we go back to the data. And before I will turn to resultative, we first have to see what is fa, basically, to account for the pattern we see. To do this, I will classify Samoan according to the typology proposed to Pilkane in 2008 for its selection of properties and its location. So, according to selectional properties, and Samoan causatives are derived by the causative prefix fa, as we know so far, which attaches to unaccusative, unergative, and middle predicates, but certainly not to unergative predicates, which is quite interesting. This is in 26e, where causative is ungrammatical in this language, while cause 1 is grammatical. So what it looks like is that fa is able to take phrasal complements up to the size of abs p, but not of voice p. But what we definitely can say is that it takes phrasal complements. But if we assume this, there are some predictions that this assumption is doing, namely that the embedded syntactic structure is preserved under causativation. Because if we causativize the whole tree up to abs p, then we assume that there is nothing going on, like argument structure right below that. And it seems like this is true. I will present you two types of evidence, namely the case of pseudo-noun interpretation of objects. So Collins has pointed out that pseudo-noun incorporation in the context of causative predicates is possibly only with embedded unaccusatives, but not with unergatives. So something like the man spoils fish, like caused bad fish, is fine, but the woman makes birds sing, where birds is incorporated, is ungrammatical. So as only internal arguments can be subject to P&E, that is shown in the paper by Collins, this pattern suggests that unaccusative objects are generated as truly internal arguments, while the external argument of a causativized unergative, or absolutive, middle predicate, of an unergative or middles as well, is still in an external argument position. So this structure is the same basically under fa. The second evidence comes from the ergative or resultative predicates. So certain ergative roots can be derived by a state divisor, which give rise to a result state meaning. In 29 we see an example. To pure ligi, we can turn it into ma ligi, to be pured. Okay, and this can be further derived by fa. So fa ma ligi, to cause to flow. Basically, we can assume that ma itself is already a categorizing head. Which is like fa ma ligi would be a stacking of categorizing heads or functional projections. Therefore, we can assume that Samoan fa causatives are phrase-taking causatives in the sense of Pilkey 2008. So now we want to see where is this causative morphology in the derivation. So on the basis of a comparison of the argument structure alternations in Samoan and English, argue that fa is a contextually defined spellout of the eventive verbalizer V. So if we turn to the causative encodative alternation in 29, we see the differences for English and Samoan. In English, when we have a root like flat, the simple state is encoded as flat. Here is an adjective. Encodative would be flatten, and the causative is the same, flatten. But if we turn to Samoan, we see a striking difference. So while we have the root malu, the simple state is encoded as malu. Encodative is the same, malu, and only the causative is specially marked. So the question is, how can we account for the different patterns, and how does this helps to answer our question we posed in the beginning? I say that we can interpret this as contextual allomorphy. So adopting the view that causative semantics is read of the structural configuration, so a state that is in an event, basically, like a bi-eventive structure. Change of state morphology can be interpreted as contextually defined spellout of V. So if we turn first to encodatives, while in English the V head is spelled out as EN, this head is silent in Samoan, as in the case of unmarked encodatives here. So another difference that will be important is that while in English it is assumed that the root directly combines with little v, in Samoan it is an XP, which has some eventive feature in it. So turning to causative, Schaeffer has argued that the agentive causa are introduced by a voice head, and this voice head is merged to a already encodative causative change of state structure, and is therefore interpreted as the agentive causa of the causative event, like just from the structure. So while the spellout is contextually determined only by its complement in English, as we have seen in the case of encodatives, because voice doesn't change the spell out here, in Samoan it looks different. So it seems like if we add a voice layer, then we get another spell out for this verbalizing head. So we can interpret this as contextual allomorphy, in that V is spelled out as 0 in the context that we have some eventuality in the complement, but the verbalizer is spelled out as fa if we have a voice layer over it at the same time. And some evidence for this assumption comes from causative with non-volitional causas, which are assumed to be introduced not by voice, but VP internal by Schaeffer 2012. So for English encodatives had been shown that unvolitional natural causas, but not volitional agentive causas can be introduced by an oblique PP. So we have something like the window broke from the storm, but the window broke from the girl or by the girl is ungrammatical. And the absence of agentive causa PPs indicates the lack of a voice layer in encodatives, and non-volitional causas are introduced inside the causative VP as an adjunct or something like that. So what this predicts for Samoan is that the absence of fa in clauses with unvolitional causas. And actually this is what we see as shown in 38, where we have the sentence the sun dried the clothes, or literally the clothes dried at the sun. But crucially here, the sun, so the causer, is not introduced as an ergative by an ergative case, so one gets an oblique case marking. So this is somehow expected from the theory or the analysis of the English type thing. So if we now shortly come to causative morphology in RSP, so the absence of causative of change of state morphology, or this EN morphology in English, is based on the structural differences between Samoan and English. So the structure of English RSP involves a manner root, which appears in the specifier of an inventive categorizer, and a stative SCAP component, which is merged in the complement position. The difference is here that as a categorizer can only categorize a single element, so a single root, and we cannot attach two roots here. And basically what happens is that the result state is realized inside an AP, and the AP blocks the spell out of little v to be en, or the change of state morphology. Now if we turn to Samoan, we see that this kind of restriction are not there in the language, or we have seen this on the analysis of Fa. So in the contrast here, the language-specific conditions for V to be spelled out as Fa are fulfilled, as the verbalizer is merged with a stative XP complement under a voice projection. And therefore we see causative morphology in RSP in Samoan. And I think I will stop here because the conclusion is just what I've said before. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have some 8 minutes for questions. Yes, please.
What leads you to believe that Fa is a morphology of V and the voice, not of the voice itself? With some fusion and
yeah, the problem would be that it would be first, it would be in the wrong position, because it would be like in the beginning of the whole complex, like Fa, like if we have example 1, for example, where we have Lamu Fa Malu, it would be something like Fa Lamu Malu directly, because it would be higher in the structure.
Unless we have fusion of the distributional morphology seems to allow for fusion.
Yes.
So we can fuse the voice can be.
But the thing is that, okay, maybe I had to integrate this into the structure, but we had also the abs p hat in between, because it assigns absolutive to the object, and so there would be another hat which would probably block the fusion, because if you fuse, like, I think so. Like we would have the whole structure would be like voice, abs, little v.
And this seems implausible that they all fuse?
Yes, because at least if we look at the literature, why or how the VSO sentence word order is derived in Samoan, is that we have some kind of VP the VP movement up to the head under T, while the argument, like the DP arguments, are evacuated before this movement. And basically what is assumed that the object is moved to abs P. I mean, you can move it somewhere else, but yes.
Any more questions? Really? No questions? Yes, please.
In your example, like 38, and in English, you can say, instead of like the begonias vertex from the intense sunlight, you can also say the intense sunlight vertex begonias. So having the inanimate causer as a subject, can this language, can Samoan have such sentence?
No.
No.
It can only be introduced by this oblique construction. But this can be I mean, there are many reasons to think why this might not be possible here. I think. I mean, it is also not really clear whether this oblique case is to interpret as a preposition or as just a case marking. So there are more difference to English, of course, than just the little v spell out contextual allomorphy.
Any more questions? Well, that's it.
So, as far as I can see, you show us on a transitive example, right?
What's my question?
Is it right? Can we have something like the river flows solid with the resultative?
Old John danced himself to death.
I have not seen those examples, but I will go back to somewhere next year, and I definitely want to check this.
So, because if you have to have this causative are only with transitive verbs,
Yes.
construal and clause, so maybe it's fake causativization. So sometimes, if you have to have a sphere of construction, you have to make the two verbs similar in their other
Yes,
structure.
yes.
So maybe it's...
Yeah, but basically this is...
we definitely need some examples with anacrisis.
Yeah, I'm
Same subject requirement.
yes, I mean, this is actually what I'm doing here in this derivation. I make the predicate similar in just a single structure. So I'm not attaching a transitive verb and another transitive verb to a more complex structure, but I fuse them in just a single structure. And there are some more questions that deals with this topic I have, and this is why I definitely want to go back to there to ask these questions, because what I propose here now is that the manner predicate is just the root, basically, right? It's the root combined with this verbalizing head. But what you can also think of is that the first predicate is more complex, so it might have objects as well, right? Something like brushing your teeth causes the teeth to be right? Where you have, or chewing gum causes your breath smells good, or something like that, right? Where you have a more complex first predicate, and then this analysis has some problems to analyze these, because then we would predict that because of the structure that we would have too fast, basically. But as far as I can see, and from the corpus I have, there is no data indicating that.
Any more questions? Okay, then let's
Thank you.
Thank you very much.